of what's happening in Libya for the continent of Africa?
I've never been to Libya, okay? So what struck me about Anjali's description is the backdrop is missing. The backdrop is the manner of change in Libya. The heavy involvement of external forces in expediting rapid fashion change in Libya, and that manner of involvement being basically bombardment. In East Africa, which is where I have been for the last 8 months, this has been the cause of huge concern. Huge concern because Libya is not atypical. Egypt and Tunisia might be slightly atypical when it comes to the African continent. Libya is far more characteristic of countries which are divided, which have leaders who've been in power for several decades, which have strong military forces and sort of formally democratic regimes, but otherwise really autocratic regimes. And where the opposition is salivating at the prospect of any kind of external involvement which will bring about a regime change inside these countries. So there is a real sense of danger around the corner. What is going to happen to the African continent? That's one thing. Second thing is the contention over Africa has become intense over the last decade. There's almost been a complete reversal of positions that existed during the Cold War. Because if you remember, in the Cold War, we used to think of the Soviet Union as typifying a military approach, and the US as standing up for some kind of development. Now it's the opposite. Now it's the Western alliance, the US, NATO, etc., which typify a military approach, and China is building roads all over Africa, and India is investing in industries all over Africa. So the prospect of increased militarization of the continent is another great fear. The sort of autocratic leaders in Africa have responded to this by trying to enter into a strategic military engagement with the West, so that they don't fall foul of them as Gaddafi did, in a way. And at the same time maintaining some kind of engagement, strong engagement on the ground with China, India, Malaysia, places like that. But it's this wider picture, this picture of stalling internal reform combined with a rapidly shifting backdrop internationally and sort of previously dominant powers who are unable to think of any other strategy except greater military involvement to hold on to their influence.
Mahmoud, you talked about some of the anxieties in Africa regarding this intervention, and today there's a meeting in Pretoria, South Africa, of the African Union. Can you say a little bit about why the African Union hasn't recognized the interim authority of the National Transitional Council, even though individual members have, and whether this meeting might lead to such recognition?
Well, the African Union is in deep crisis itself. Without the vote of two of its leading members, South Africa and Nigeria, there would have been no UN intervention, no NATO intervention. And they know it. Having voted in favor of that intervention, now they are crying foul and saying that our efforts to mediate were ignored. So they appear like just a useless body, a gathering where people can air their grievances, but nothing more than that. So they have to salvage themselves. The reluctance to recognize the transitional government in Libya is an admission that they don't see an easy way out of this dilemma. So they will have to recognize it. If not today, then tomorrow. Their problem is, they have sat through a series of crises over the last few years. You had Ivory Coast, equally divided society. The thrust, the Mbeki initiative on Ivory Coast was basically about getting the two sides to talk to one another. Maybe even a kind of solution that was found in Kenya, because think of it, Kenya after the election was very similar to Ivory Coast. The government in power had lost the election. The opposition was crying foul. Right, similar to Ivory Coast. And yet the UN and the US solution was not to throw that government out, but actually to force the opposition to enter into an alliance whereby the government kept on being the government, and the opposition was simply ensured that the next time round there would be a free election. So why not in Ivory Coast? The rules are changing from country to country depending on the interests involved. So the African Union is sort of irrelevant.